The man I worked alongside every day thought he could steal my future with a single bold lie. He took credit for months of my work, basked in praise that wasn't his, and expected me to stay quiet. But what he didn't realize was that I had proof, and the CEO himself was about to see it. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember the day it happened as if it's etched into my bones. The office was humming with the usual rhythm. The low whir of printers, the distant chatter of colleagues, the clinking of coffee mugs against desks. I had barely slept the night before, but I was running on adrenaline and pride. My project, the one I had poured every ounce of myself into, was finally ready to be presented. It wasn't just a report or a spreadsheet. It was months of painstaking research, late nights with my laptop balanced on the kitchen table, and early mornings when the office was still dark and quiet except for me. This project wasn't just work. It was proof that my dedication mattered, that I wasn't invisible in a company where louder personalities often drowned out quieter diligence. I had rehearsed my points, checked every chart, double-checked the data sources. When the day of the big meeting came, I walked into that room with nervous excitement. But that excitement crumbled in seconds. The moment the CEO asked to see the project, I expected my name to be on everyone's lips. Instead, I watched in disbelief as my coworker, a man I'd long suspected of being opportunistic, stood up with a broad, self-assured smile. With smooth confidence, he claimed ownership of the work that had consumed my life for weeks. He spoke as if it were his creation, his late nights, his sacrifices. And the worst part, no one questioned him. I sat frozen in my chair, my palms pressed hard against my notebook under the table. My face burned, but I forced it into neutrality. To protest in that moment would have made me look unprofessional, like I was grasping for credit. I bit my tongue so hard it almost bled, willing myself not to speak out of turn. The CEO nodded with approval as my coworker spoke, occasionally jotting down notes and asking him follow-up questions. Questions I had meticulously prepared answers for. And each time, my coworker parroted phrases I recognized, little snippets I had written in my drafts. Every sentence felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. When the CEO finally said, "This is excellent work, exactly the kind of innovation we want to see more of," the room erupted in supportive murmurs. My coworker beamed, basking in praise that rightfully should have been mine. Worse still, the CEO added, "This could put you in line for a promotion." That was the moment my stomach dropped. It wasn't just stolen credit anymore. It was stolen opportunity. All my quiet labor, all my hours of effort, had been hijacked to fuel someone else's rise. I remember staring at the polished conference table, my reflection faintly staring back at me in the wood grain. Inside, I was screaming. On the outside, I kept my breathing steady, pretending to jot down a few notes to mask the shaking in my hands. That was the day my world shifted. I walked into that meeting hopeful and eager, and I walked out feeling invisible, humiliated, and betrayed. But I didn't know then that the very arrogance he flaunted in that room would become the crack in his armor. And as much as it stung to sit in silence that day, I made myself a promise. I would find a way to make the truth undeniable. When I look back on it now, the warning signs were there long before that fateful meeting. They weren't loud or obvious, but like hairline cracks in a wall, they were spreading, waiting for the right pressure to split everything wide open. I suppose the best place to begin is with who I was at the time. I was in my mid-30s, not new to the professional world, but not so far along that I had the luxury of coasting. Every advancement mattered. Every project was a chance to prove that I deserved my seat at the table. I wasn't flashy or the type to fill the room with jokes and handshakes. Instead, I was deliberate, careful. I believed in letting the work speak for itself, in keeping my head down and producing results that couldn't be ignored, and for the most part, that strategy worked. My bosses respected my diligence, my attention to detail, and my ability to quietly untangle problems others didn't even notice. But it also meant I was often overlooked when it came to recognition. People saw the outcome without seeing the hours of quiet labor behind it. That's where he came in, my coworker. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Mark. Mark was everything I wasn't. He was charismatic in a way that made people lean in when he spoke. He had a quick smile, an easy laugh, and a knack for turning even the simplest update into a performance. On the surface, he was likable. People in the office often praised his confidence and leadership skills. But if you worked closely with him, as I unfortunately did, you saw the other side. Mark rarely lifted a finger on the projects we shared. He would hover near your desk, ask pointed questions about your progress, and then magically repackage your answers in the next meeting as if they were his own insights. He had a gift for making other people's hard work look like his brilliance. It wasn't outright theft at first. It was subtle, repeating a phrase I'd used during brainstorming, casually mentioning an idea I'd tested out but not fully explained to anyone else. Things small enough that I could brush them off with a tight smile, telling myself, it doesn't matter who gets credit for every little piece, as long as the project succeeds. But over time, those little instances piled up. I'd find myself shrinking back in meetings, choosing not to share my ideas too openly, because I knew that once they were in the air, they'd no longer belong to me. If I stayed quiet, at least he couldn't twist my thoughts into his glory. Outside of work, I'd hear him bragging casually in the break room about how he came up with a solution that I had, in fact, stayed late one night to finalize. I'd sip my coffee, keep my eyes down, and remind myself that I wasn't there to get into petty battles. My focus was the long game. But there was one particular moment that, in hindsight, should have warned me of what was to come. I was at my desk one Friday evening, finishing up a draft while most of the office had already emptied. Mark walked by, noticed me still working, and leaned against my cubicle with that easy grin of his. "You work too hard," he said, almost teasing. "You know, people don't really notice the details. They notice the presentation, how you sell it. That's what really matters." At the time, I smiled faintly and let the comment pass. But later that night, as I closed my laptop and rubbed the ache from my wrists, his words echoed in my mind. They noticed the presentation. It was as if he was telling me outright how he played the game. He didn't care about the foundation, the data, the grind. He cared about standing in the spotlight when the curtain rose, regardless of who built the stage. Still, I wanted to believe I was being too harsh. Maybe I was just sensitive. Maybe my quiet nature made me feel threatened by someone more extroverted. I gave him the benefit of the doubt again and again, convincing myself that as long as I stayed true to my values, I'd come out ahead. That was the normal world for me back then. A balance of quiet diligence on my part and sly opportunism on his. I accepted the small irritations as part of the job, never imagining how far he'd eventually take things. But deep down, a small part of me knew. A voice I tried to ignore whispered that if Mark was ever given a bigger chance, he wouldn't hesitate to take it. even if it meant stepping on me to get there, and soon, that chance arrived. It was supposed to be one of the proudest days of my career. The project I'd been working on for weeks was more than just another assignment. It was a high-stakes initiative the CEO himself had taken an interest in, something that could shape the company's direction for the next year. I'd been chosen to lead the research and build the framework, and although the workload was overwhelming at times, I felt honored. This was my chance to prove myself, to show that I wasn't just reliable but also innovative. I still remember the morning of the big presentation. I arrived early, as usual, to print out supporting documents and rehearse my points. My slides were polished, my notes meticulous. I even had backup copies saved on a flash drive in case the projector failed. That was how prepared I was. Nothing left to chance. By the time the executives gathered in the conference room, I was nervous but steady. I sat with my notebook open, pen in hand, my heart beating in rhythm with the ticking clock on the wall. I told myself, just breathe. You know this material better than anyone, eh? And then, in a moment that still feels surreal, everything flipped. When the CEO asked to see the results, I expected to be called forward. Instead, Mark, with that familiar, practiced smile, rose smoothly from his chair. Without hesitation, he walked to the front of the room as if the project had been his all along. I sat frozen, my pen clutched tightly between my fingers. Mark began speaking confidently, clicking through the slides I had prepared. He described the problem we were addressing, outlined the strategy, and highlighted the potential outcomes. His words flowed easily, almost too easily, because they weren't his. They were mine. Every phrase, every carefully structured sentence, came from the hours I had spent agonizing over the best way to communicate our vision. At first, I thought maybe he was just introducing the project. That any second, he'd gesture to me and say, "Of course, my name is the one who put this together, and she'll walk us through the details." But that moment never came. Instead, he spoke for 30 uninterrupted minutes, answering questions with half-remembered versions of my data, using examples I had written in my draft notes. He even paused at one point to make a little joke. A joke I had made to him in private while we were discussing the project's early stages. And the room laughed, not knowing it was mine. I forced myself to stay still, my hands trembling in my lap. Inside, my mind was a whirlwind. Do I speak up? Do I interrupt him? Do I call this out in front of everyone? But I knew what would happen if I did. I would look defensive, unprofessional, like someone grasping for credit. Worse, it would make me seem small, so I sat there silent. As my heart pounded louder and louder in my chest, the CEO leaned back in his chair, clearly impressed. He nodded several times during the presentation and asked pointed questions. Questions Mark barely managed to bluff his way through. To my horror, the CEO didn't seem to notice the gaps. He was too focused on the polished delivery. And then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. "This," the CEO said, gesturing toward the screen, "is excellent work. Exactly the kind of initiative we need to reward. Mark, keep this up, and I see a leadership role in your near future." Applause rippled through the room. My co-workers murmured their approval. Mark smiled like a man who had just won a prize. Meanwhile, I sat staring down at my notebook, unable to trust my voice even if I had tried to speak. My pen had carved a small dent into the paper where I had been gripping it too hard. I felt as if the air had been punched out of me, my chest tight, my throat dry. That was the moment the line was crossed. It wasn't just about stolen words or stolen effort anymore. This was my future he was taking, my reputation, My chance to finally step out of the shadows and into the light. Gone. Because he had the arrogance to present himself as the genius behind my sweat and sacrifice. And as I sat there, my silence heavy, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let him get away with it. Asterisk in the days following that meeting, I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. I'd walk through the office, hearing whispers of admiration directed not at me, but at Mark. People congratulated him in the break room, clapped him on the back as if he had pulled off something extraordinary. I'd sit at my desk, my inbox filling with messages that copied him on every thread. Requests for his insights about the very system I had designed. It was disorienting. Like I had been erased from my own story at first. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd give me credit in the next team huddle. Or at least acknowledge my role privately. That's what a decent person would do. But Mark wasn't decent. If anything, the praise heaped onto him seemed to fuel his arrogance. Within days, he began speaking as though the project truly was his creation. He strutted into meetings with an air of importance, dropping hints about his process and his late nights. He was rewriting history right in front of me, and no one seemed to notice. The part that stung most wasn't even his words, but the way he dismissed me in the process. When colleagues tried to include me in conversations about the project, Mark would wave his hand and say, "Oh, she just helped with some of the smaller details." Smaller details. As if I hadn't built the entire foundation brick by brick. I tried to interject a few times, politely clarifying, but he had a way of cutting me off smoothly, redirecting the attention back to himself before my voice could find traction. It wasn't clumsy or obvious. It was practiced. He had perfected the art of drowning someone out while looking charming. The office dynamic shifted quickly. Suddenly, I wasn't the go-to person for questions. People bypassed me, going straight to Mark. The project, once my proudest achievement, had become his ticket to stardom. And he didn't stop there. One afternoon, during a casual conversation with a few colleagues, he leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You know, I've always had a knack for strategy. Some people get lost in the weeds, but I see the bigger picture." Everyone nodded in agreement, not realizing that the so-called bigger picture had been my late nights staring at spreadsheets. My meticulous notes. What cut deepest was how he began mocking me in subtle, veiled ways. "Don't worry," he told me once with that infuriating grin. "I'll make sure you get some recognition when I'm promoted. You've been supportive, as if I were nothing more than his assistant." That was the moment the anger inside me began to shift. Up until then, I had been hurt, embarrassed, maybe even in denial. But now I felt something colder, a simmering determination that coiled tight in my chest. Still, I knew I couldn't lash out recklessly. That's what he expected, for me to break, to look bitter or unprofessional. No, if I was going to confront him, it had to be on my terms. I needed patience. I needed the right weapon. But while I was trying to steady myself, Mark kept pushing, kept tightening the noose in the next team meeting. He introduced so-called new improvements to the project. Improvements he had fished out of me the week before. In a one-on-one conversation, I had thought we were brainstorming. He had been mining me for more material. And now, here he was, packaging my ideas as his own once again, while the CEO nodded approvingly. I sat there, my hands folded tightly on the table, my knuckles white. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the kind that makes your pulse throb in your ears. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to stay still, but inside, I was screaming. It was clear now. This wasn't a what-I'm theft. This was a campaign. He wasn't just stealing my work. He was systematically erasing me. And he was daring me, in his smug little way, to stop him. What he didn't know, of course, was that I already had the seeds of his downfall in my hands. I just hadn't decided yet how, or when, I would use them. There's only so much quiet endurance a person can manage before something inside finally cracks. For me, that moment came in yet another meeting, one that started like so many others, with Mark seated at the front, basking in the glow of borrowed brilliance. The agenda that day was to review his project's progress and talk about future applications. I had, of course, done most of the legwork on the updates. Out of habit, or maybe hope, I brought my notes, ready to contribute where it made sense. But the moment I opened my mouth, he shut me down. I'd barely started a sentence. One thing I found when analyzing the data, before Mark leaned forward, cutting me off with a dismissive chuckle. "I'll cover that in a second," he said smoothly, as if I were a child speaking out of turn. The room laughed with him, not unkindly, but enough to sting. Then he launched into the very point I had been about to make, lifting it straight from the document I had sent him the night before. I froze, my words hanging unfinished in the air. The humiliation was sharp and immediate. It wasn't just that he stole my idea again. It was that he silenced me in front of everyone, reducing me to background noise in a conversation I had built from the ground up. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to look down at my notebook, scribbling nonsense just to hide the shaking of my hand. In that instant, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was resolve. I remember thinking, if I stay silent, this will never end. He'll climb higher and higher on the rungs of my work until there's nothing left of me. But a shadow in his story. It wasn't paranoia. You could see the trajectory in the way management looked at him, the approving nods, the whispered conversations, the way his name came up more and more often in the same breath as leadership potential. And I realized then, with chilling clarity, that if I didn't stop him, he wasn't just going to steal my project. He was going to steal my career. That thought was the breaking point. When the meeting ended, I didn't linger as I usually did. I gathered my things quickly, my movements sharper than normal, and walked straight back to my desk. My heartbeat was steady now, not frantic but firm, like a drumbeat of determination. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folders I had carefully organized. Since the very beginning of the project, drafts upon drafts, every email I had sent to him and others, notes with time-stamped entries, and the crown jewel, the internal project log system that tracked every edit made to the files, complete with usernames and timestamps. Every change, every late-night update, every breakthrough idea had my name stamped all over it. The truth was there, laid out in black and white, undeniable. I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in weeks, a sense of calm settled over me. Mark thought he was clever, thought he had outplayed me, but he had no idea that I was sitting on the very proof that could unravel everything. He'd built on lies. I didn't know exactly how I would use it yet, or when, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to let this go. He had crossed the line, and now, for the first time, I felt ready, almost eager, to push back. Once I'd admitted to myself that I couldn't let Mark's theft go unchallenged. The question became how. How do you fight someone who thrives on charm, who knows how to spin a room in his favor, while you're the one who prefers quiet work in the background? The answer, I realized, was that I didn't need to out-talk him. I needed to outprove him. That night, after everyone else had gone home, I stayed late at my desk. The office was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a cleaner's vacuum. My screen glowed in the dim light as I dug deeper into the digital trail I had left behind. It was all there, every draft I had created, every version of the presentation with my initials marked in the metadata, every email where I shared updates or explained the reasoning behind my choices. And best of all, the internal system logs, automatic entries the software generated with every edit, a timeline that stretched back weeks, documenting each keystroke. My name appeared over and over, tied to every meaningful update, while his appeared only rarely, and always on superficial things. Like reordering slides or adjusting a font, it was ironclad. Evidence no one could argue with as I scrolled through the files. A wave of reassurance washed over me. For weeks I had felt invisible, erased. But the truth was here, preserved, undeniable. It gave me strength just to see it all laid out. To know that I wasn't crazy, that my work had been real, and it could not be erased by his arrogance. The trick, I realized, was timing it. If I marched into the CEO's office right then, slammed down the evidence, and declared that Mark was a fraud, I'd look rash, emotional. Worse, it might make me seem petty, like I was trying to discredit a colleague out of jealousy. No, I needed patience. I needed to wait for the right moment, the one where the evidence would not only defend me but expose him in a way no one could ignore. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. A word spread that the CEO wanted a follow-up presentation, a chance to see how Mark's project could be scaled further. The room would be full again, executives waiting with sharp questions and high expectations. I knew Mark well enough to realize he'd be unprepared. He was good at swagger, but not at substance. And this time, he wouldn't have my quiet help feeding him answers in the background. That would be my moment. I could already imagine the scene. Him stumbling through questions, bluffing, trying to skate on confidence alone. And then me, calm and prepared, stepping in not with accusations but with evidence. Not a single outburst, not a single word of anger. Just proof. Simple, undeniable proof. The more I pictured it, the more a strange calm settled over me. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt like I had control again. I didn't need to argue with him or beg for recognition. All I had to do was hold my ground and let the facts speak for themselves. It was almost poetic. Really, he had stolen my work thinking he could get away with it because I was too quiet, too reserved, too unwilling to fight. But it was that very quiet diligence, my habit of keeping records, of documenting every detail, that had created the weapon he would never see coming. So I waited, letting him bask in his false confidence. Even as I quietly gathered my arsenal, I saved copies of everything to a secure drive, organized it into a clear timeline, and rehearsed how I would present it when the moment came. And with every day that passed, with every smug smile he threw my way, I grew more certain. When the curtain finally rose again, he would walk into that room thinking it was his stage. But this time, I would be the one holding the script. The day of the follow-up presentation arrived with an almost eerie sense of calm. I woke early that morning, long before the alarm, and brewed myself a pot of tea instead of coffee. I wanted clarity, not jitters. As I sipped, I went over my notes one last time, though I barely needed to. I had lived and breathed this project for so long that every figure, every chart, every rationale was etched into my mind like the lines of a well-worn poem. But this time, it wasn't about knowing the work. It was about knowing how to use it. When I arrived at the office, Mark was already there, standing near the conference room with that same smug grin I had come to despise. He wore a new tie, bold, expensive looking, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who thought he had already won. "Big day," he said as I passed. His tone was light, almost teasing, as if I were a bystander to his triumph. "Yes," I replied evenly, offering nothing more. Inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. He had no idea what was coming. The executives filed in, the air thick with anticipation. The CEO sat at the head of the table, expectant. "All right, Mark," he said, "let's see how your project is shaping up." And then it began. At first, Mark launched into his usual performance, clicking through slides with practiced ease. He had rehearsed the surface well enough, but it quickly became obvious he was out of his depth. When the CEO asked a pointed question about the underlying data model, Mark hesitated, then gave a vague answer that drew a few frowns. Another executive pressed him. "Can you explain why you weighted that variable so heavily?" Mark stammered, deflecting with a smile. "Well, you know, it's about intuition and, leadership instincts." His words trailed off. The room grew tense. The polished facade was beginning to crack. I watched, calm and steady, as he struggled. Every time he faltered, my heart beat a little slower, more controlled. This was the moment I had waited for. Not to humiliate him, but to let him unravel himself. Finally, the CEO leaned forward, his voice sharp. "These are serious gaps, Mark. If you don't have the answers, who does?" That was my cue. I cleared my throat gently, my voice steady but carrying across the room. "Actually, I might be able to help with that." Every head turned toward me. For the first time in weeks, I felt their eyes not skimming past me but landing squarely where they belonged. I opened my folder and laid out a series of documents, printed timelines, drafts, and the project log reports. I kept my tone professional, measured. "Here's the detailed breakdown of each decision point, along with the data sources. As you can see, every stage was documented. These logs show exactly when and how the updates were made." The CEO leaned in, adjusting his glasses. He scanned the papers, his brow furrowing as he traced the entries. My name appeared again and again, attached to every meaningful change. I could feel Mark's eyes on me, wide and darting, but I didn't look at him. This wasn't about trading glares. It was about letting the truth do the talking. Another executive asked a follow-up, and I answered clearly, confidently, pointing to the evidence. The more I spoke, the more the room shifted. The skeptical looks faded, replaced by nods of understanding. The tension drained away from me and landed squarely on Mark. By the time I finished, there was no doubt left. The contrast was undeniable. His vague bluster against my detailed proof. The truth was in front of them, stark and irrefutable. I closed my folder and folded my hands neatly on the table. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the weight lift from my chest. Mark had stolen my voice once, but today, I had taken it back. The silence that followed my explanation was deafening. The CEO held the documents in his hands, flipping back and forth between the pages with deliberate slowness. His expression shifted as he read. First curiosity, then recognition, and finally, something sharper. Disappointment, anger. When he lifted his gaze, it wasn't at me. It was at Mark. "Is there a reason?" the CEO asked, his voice calm but cutting. "That your name appears only a handful of times in these logs, and only for superficial edits, while hers appears throughout the entirety of the project. Mark's confident smile faltered. For the first time, I saw a crack in his composure. His lips parted, but no words came out. He blinked rapidly, then forced a laugh. "Oh, well, you know how it is." I had her handle the technical details while I focused on the big picture vision. "That's why." The CEO cut him off with a raised hand. "Vision doesn't overwrite databases. Vision doesn't adjust formulas or build models. This isn't delegation, Mark. This is misrepresentation." Mark's face flushed red. He straightened in his chair, his voice rising. "That's not fair. I was leading the project, giving direction. She just followed instructions. I stayed silent, my hands folded calmly in front of me. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The truth was sitting on the table, speaking louder than I ever could." The other executives exchanged looks, some skeptical, others outright disdainful. One of them, a woman from finance, leaned forward. "If you were leading, then answer this. Why was the variable weighting adjusted mid-cycle? And what impact did it have on the projections?" It was a softball question, one I could have answered in my sleep. But Mark, he froze. His mouth opened, then shut. He stammered something incoherent, his voice cracking under the weight of expectation. The CEO's jaw tightened. He turned back to me. "Do you know the answer?" "Yes," I replied smoothly, and gave a precise explanation, complete with references to the logs and data tables. The room nodded. The contrast was undeniable. That was when Mark lost his grip completely. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, his tone defensive and loud. "She's twisting things to make me look bad. She's been gunning for me this whole time." His words echoed through the conference room, shrill against the quiet professionalism of the setting. No one looked convinced. If anything, his outburst only confirmed what the evidence had already made clear. The CEO's voice was low but firm when he spoke again. "Enough. It's over, Mark." The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. Mark's eyes darted around desperately, searching for someone to back him up, to nod, to give him an out. But no one did. His allies were silent, their expressions closed off. Even those who had once been charmed by his confidence looked away now, unwilling to be associated with him. I finally allowed myself to look at him directly. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table. In that moment, he looked small. All the arrogance, all the smugness, had drained away, leaving only a man cornered by his own lies. And there it was, the justice I had been waiting for. Not loud, not dramatic, just the simple, undeniable truth catching up with someone who thought they could outrun it forever. Asterisk. The CEO leaned back in his chair, the documents still in front of him. His silence was heavy, the kind that fills a room more than shouting ever could. Then, with deliberate clarity, he spoke. "It's clear," he said, his eyes scanning the table before resting on me. "This work belongs to her, not to you, Mark." The words struck like a gavel, final and unarguable. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was the recognition I had been craving, the validation that all those late nights and early mornings hadn't been swallowed into a void. The CEO had said it out loud, in front of everyone. There was a beat of silence before one of the executives murmured, "Excellent work." Another chimed in, "Truly impressive." The tide shifted all at once, like a current reversing. Their nods, their words, their gazes, all of it turned toward me. I sat straight, my hands folded, refusing to let my emotions spill over. But inside, my heart swelled, not with gloating or arrogance, but with a deep, quiet relief. Finally, the truth had a voice. Mark, on the other hand, sat stiffly, his face ashen. His eyes flickered desperately from one person to another, searching for an ally, but found none. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, brittle line. He looked like a man watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. The CEO closed the folder and slid it toward me. Thank you for your diligence. This project is exactly the kind of initiative we need in leadership. We'll be discussing next steps for your role moving forward. The implication was clear. Where moments ago Mark had been the golden boy, now his future was hanging by a thread, and mine was finally in the light. Mark muttered something under his breath, but it was too low to catch. His shoulders sagged as he sank back in his chair, the fight gone from him. The meeting wrapped up soon after, but as people filtered out of the room, several colleagues stopped to shake my hand, to congratulate me. Their smiles were genuine, their words warm, and though I had imagined this moment so many times, his downfall, my recognition, it still felt surreal to stand in it. I caught sight of Mark lingering near the door, his posture deflated. For once, there was no arrogance, no swagger, just silence. And in that silence, I realized I didn't need to say a word. The evidence had spoken for me. That was my victory. Not loud, not vengeful, just clean, undeniable justice. Asterisk in the days and weeks after that fateful meeting, the office felt like a completely different place. For the first time in months, I could walk through the hallways without that crushing weight in my chest. People stopped me in passing to offer kind words. Great job on the project. You really carried that. Impressive work. It wasn't the shallow flattery Mark used to collect. It was genuine, spoken with respect. The CEO followed through on his promise, too. He invited me into more high-level discussions, gave me a platform to share my ideas directly, and made it clear that my contributions were valued. When the promotion talks resurfaced, my name was at the top of the list, not because I had fought loudly for attention, but because the work itself had proved my worth. As for Mark, the shift in his status was immediate and brutal. Overnight, the man who used to strut around like he owned the place became a cautionary tale. He wasn't fired outright. Not then, at least. But he was sidelined. Instead of leading projects, he was quietly shuffled into tasks no one cared about. His name absent from any meaningful conversations. His once loud voice in the office faded to a whisper. I heard whispers from colleagues that he tried to spin the story, blaming me for setting him up. But no one bought it. The proof had been too clear, the performance too public. His charm, once his greatest weapon, rang hollow now. People avoided him, the way you avoid a crumbling structure you don't want to be near when it falls. Eventually, a few months later, he left the company altogether. Some said he quit to pursue other opportunities. Others suspected he was quietly asked to leave. Either way, he was gone. His legacy in our office nothing more than a bitter reminder of arrogance undone by truth. For me, life settled into something steadier, stronger. I no longer questioned whether I deserved to be where I was. That meeting had shown me, and everyone else, that I had always deserved it. And oddly enough, I was grateful for the struggle. Without it, I might have continued to shrink back, to let louder voices take up space I had earned. Now I stood taller, not because I had shouted the loudest, but because I had endured, prepared, and waited for the right moment to speak. When I think back on it, the moral feels simple, almost poetic. Arrogance builds castles on sand, and dishonesty always collapses under the weight of truth. Mark thought he could rise on the strength of my silence, but it was that very silence, the meticulous records, the patience, The calm, that brought him down. And me? I learned that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through evidence, through timing, through the undeniable power of truth.